welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, joined by our producer, Justin Stein. And today we've got some guests from the R&D team, the football R&D team specifically at SIS, a group that we passionately refer to as JEDS, Jeds. We've got our lead research analyst, Alex Vigderman,
Hello.
And our two football associates, Stephen Polacheck and James Weaver. We've brought this Bird Brain Trust together to discuss EPA. And I think we're kind of coming in with the assumption that the listener knows what EPA is. This isn't an EPA explainer. We've done that episode before. Search for it. EPA, briefly, is expected points added. It is putting the context of every play that happens in a football game into points instead of yards, touchdowns, and turnovers. So you can figure out what the value of going from 1 point on the field on a certain down and distance is to another. And it's a more kind of holistic view of what things are worth on the fields. And that's actually a good starting off point. So we want to talk about what we like about EPA. We want to talk about what we don't like about EPA. And we want to just really dive deep on this stat and have a conversation about what we really think in a nuanced sense about EPA, why CPOE versus EPA graphs aren't always the most satisfying thing, even though they are certainly very interesting.
I have a jumping off point because this is going to start by sounding semantic, but I would argue that EPA isn't a stat, it's a framework. So it's similar to the way that like wins above replacement is not an individual statistic, it is a way of evaluating players.
Definitely sounds semantic so far. Go on.
Yeah. So the idea is that EPA there's not one solution to EPA. There's not one metric that EPA is. EPA is a way of consolidating information so that you can put things into a common currency. But there are many different ways to get to EPA, different inputs you could use.
In basketball, a point is a point is a point. In football, a yard is a yard is a yard. But an EPA is not an EPA is not an EPA. There are different ways that you can consider that. Like it's kind of in the eye of the beholder a bit. There's no agreed upon calculation even.
Yeah, there's if you took a bunch of EPA models and sort of put them up next to each other, you'd get very high agreement, 80% or so, where the numbers would look very similar, the inputs would look very similar. But there are some small choices in how you could build an EPA model that we've made ourselves in building our EPA model that could be points of discussion. And it's not necessarily that there is a right answer. I think if there was sort of like objective right answer, we might have more agreement generally on how to calculate it. But there are some sort of like human choices that you can make in building an EPA model that affect downstream the way that you evaluate things. So that is, I would say, a good and bad thing. It's not great to have a stat that people can disagree on, where there's a little bit of fuzziness there. But I do think that there's value in being able to tailor your calculation to the kinds of inputs you think are important and draw distinctions between things that aren't.
Yeah. Okay. So stats versus sort of like metrics or analytics, whatever you want to call it. There's a place for that. Like obviously, like there is what something's value is on the market. And then depending on how you value things, you might think that things are over or undervalued as a result of that. And EPA, in a sort of simple way, like it's not like war, right? Where you're really involving a whole lot of different things there. It's basically just the down distance and field position and how that changed from one play to another or one drive to another, whatever you want to do it by. So like it's a bit less defined. We'll call that a disadvantage.
Yeah. And I think even one thing that you did not include that I think is a decision that people would make differently when building the model is like how much input data you're putting in. So like how many years, what game situations, if you're like potentially cutting out some situations.
End of the half, right?
Yeah. And the years thing enters into like the discussion of a sort of scoring environment. Like if you want to use more data to get a better understanding of each individual game state, you need more data so that you can accurately represent that. But if you're using more data, you're using more years, then you're sort of smushing together different seasons that might have had different scoring situations. So like more recent seasons would be much more aggressive on fourth down. So your expected points on third and fourth down looks a lot different the last couple of years than it would even 4 or 5 years ago. So if you're using a model that only uses a couple of seasons, it's going to look a lot different than a model that uses, 10 seasons.
Right. So like other people changing the way that they behave changes the way that your EPA will look, basically. Okay, that's another thing that's pretty interesting. So I feel like as this conversation shapes up, it's not so much strengths and weaknesses. It's like these are things that are kind of both at once. Okay, I want to give another one. My favorite thing about EPA is what I was talking about before, where it puts everything into one metric, because football doesn't have a way to do that naturally. When we talk about a quarterback, we have to talk about attempts and completions and yards and touchdowns, and this is all baked into there. It is the value of the play, and this is, in my opinion, the best number that we have to represent what the value of any individual play is as a whole.
And jumping off of that point you just made about saying the value of like a quarterback, there were 5. I just have the stat in front of me. There's 5 quarterbacks that really jump ahead of the pack in terms of EPA from last season, and it's pretty much the cast of characters you would argue were the MVP candidates. It's Mahomes, it's Stafford, it's Rodgers, it's Prescott, it's Brady. Those 5 are just head and shoulders above everybody else. And I think EPA does, because it's not just looking at total yards or total touchdowns. Now that's part of the equation, but also situations matter. Those guys really come up.
Did I hear you say Prescott?
I did say Prescott.
And that would be expected to you? That would be like, he was an MVP candidate last year?
In the running, I would say so. I by no means take this as me pounding the table for Prescott as an MVP. I put him behind the other 4, but
you think he's in that category? Like it's not. Yeah.
Last season, I would say it was worth his name belongs in the discussion of being towards the top.
Yeah, I think it's also important. Like if we're talking about the back end of the top 5, that's not necessarily like prime MVP conversation in terms of like, that's down ballot voting to some extent. So
now for what it's worth, to just throw the name out there, Josh Allen falls down in 12th in total EPA of quarterbacks last year with 100 attempts.
That's just passing?
For passing. Just passing.
Right.
Just passing.
I think he makes up a lot of that value being their entire running game.
Yes.
But the nice thing, as you were saying, like the EPA gets both of those and counts them equally, and you can smush them together and it means something, as opposed to smushing together passing and rushing yards and calling it scrimmage yards or something like that.
So that's a good point. We've seen that, like, if you look at combined EPA for quarterbacks and you were to make the leaderboard based on that and not the passing list that Stephen just made, I think you would find that like the Tyrod Taylor type quarterbacks of the world start to move up the list. Like guys that have some running in their game, even like a Trubisky or a Daniel Jones, they would rank higher usually on those lists. And is that to say that we previously undervalued those sorts of players, and these players are actually more valuable than we might have thought? I know, like from a scouting background perspective, I would say that those guys stink, and I have no interest in them. But I think you could look at a leaderboard and you could say, look, he's 15th in EPA, something like that. That's a middle of the pack quarterback. How do you guys think about that? Like, are passing EPA and rushing? Here's another jumping off point: passing EPA and rushing EPA. Like, are they the same thing?
No. I have you're making me go through all my stats right here. In rushing, in terms of rushing EPA, you look at the top 10 in total EPA last year for players that had 20 or more rushing attempts. Only one of them is a running back and one of them is a wide receiver. Everybody else are quarterbacks. So that top of that list, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Jonathan Taylor. Because I think part of the rushing, and I guess we're getting into the negative part of it here, a rushing EPA, if you get 5 yards on 1st and 10, that basically is almost nothing in terms of
fairly
EPA.
Positive, yeah.
And that's a great run for a running back. You give me 5 yards every carry, and I would bet that most coaches would sign up for the running backs getting 5 yards. Now, when you think about a quarterback running, when it's not an offense, you want to say designed specifically for them to just run on any given down, but that idea of scrambling for first downs, picking up conversions on third down, the Jalen Hurts, the Josh Allens, heck, Herbert and Tannehill come into the top 5 on this list. Those guys are making a ton of EPA by extending drives, just by picking up these little gimme scrambles. And that's influencing the rushing EPA in a very, very different way, rather than to say that they're the best rushers in the league, because I think I would sign up for Jonathan Taylor as my running back.
I think too, like if you think of EPA in like a historical sense, so as we move into this era of pass first and early down passing and getting more efficient on offenses, if you look back in time to see, these EPA numbers of running backs, 10, 15 years ago, I'm sure those would honestly probably be higher than what they would be now, with being more efficient on runs and stuff, so to speak, with it being more of a run-heavy league.
Yeah, I think that if you just think about it in a pure like math sense, like the percentage of plays that are passes is higher now. And so the expectation for the play leans towards what you expect from a pass play, as opposed to in the past where it's more 50-50. The expectation is more evenly split between passing and running. So a run looks worse now because the expectation is taken more from the population of passing plays.
Would EPA be a more interesting stat if it was divided by pass and run plays? There would be some like weird things there, like scrambles and things like that Stephen's talking about. But I mean, we deal with those already for lots of different situations. Would EPA be more useful to think about if we thought of it as, I think what we've sort of referred to as like EPA above average or over expectation, which is a little bit of a mind warp?
So for what it's worth, the total points system, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, over the course of this conversation, builds in that exact notion of what you're talking about, like a difference in expectation.
Which it has to, because it's a player stat, and it would be totally inappropriate to. Well, how about that? EPA is not really a player stat,
right? But I think that's the key answer to your question. Like, would it be better to split EPA by different play types? Yes, when evaluating players, potentially, not necessarily when evaluating a team.
But what about what Stephen said before about how you would take that 5-yard run on first down every time? Because there's very little risk involved. Like if you know you got that 5 yards and you're not having to risk an incomplete pass and the way that can disrupt a drive and things like that, you would take that every time. You would take a 5-yard run. A 5-yard run is kind of better than a 5-yard pass because you didn't have to risk as much to get it. So shouldn't that be something that we're at least like thinking about?
I would say that you're sort of mixing using the result with the decision where you didn't know the result. So like if I knew I was getting 5 yards, that's different than the distribution of outcomes on a running play. Like Stephen was saying, it's good to get 5 yards. That's because it's kind of above average, or above median, I suppose.
I am combining what before and after, but like my point, I think still stands that like the coach would rather have called a running play to get the 5 yards than call the passing play to get the 5 yards because they didn't put their neck out.
Well, I'm with it. I think you're getting towards a kind of an argument of the bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Of you can have this, you want to say more expected outcome of you're probably going to get somewhere between 2 and 5 yards on this run, or you can take the pass, which gives you anywhere from taking a sack, which really hurts you, to gaining 40 yards and a gigantic multiple point swing.
There's a risk. There's a larger variance on a pass play, and therefore there's a higher risk. So just going into it, maybe that's more fair of a way to present the conversation, Alex. Going into it, the risk is higher. And I think that if you draw that out, then I think you'd probably agree that after the fact, what I'm saying makes sense based on that. But like, does that matter?
Yeah, I think when the thing is that EPA is generally not discussed in the context of like individual play selection and stuff like that. It's more discussed at this sort of like more holistic level. And so, yeah, when talking about from like a coach's perspective of making decisions, you really should take into account like the distribution of outcomes and the risk profile and that sort of thing. That really doesn't enter into it when we're talking about like who should win MVP based on total EPA. And so, there. I think that there are sort of different, in the same way that there might be different EPA models for different ways of thinking about the game. There should probably also be different like adjustments on top of it, depending on the context in which you're using it.
Right. So if you're asking the question, how good a play is this, then it should be EPA like we're talking about now. If you're asking the question, how good a rushing play was this, you might want to do that sort of extra contextual version that we were talking about.
I guess something that, and this is a kind of a bridge into a larger discussion of, they have a pass play and a run play kind of have a symbiotic relationship, that your offense cannot be only running and your offense cannot be only passing. That doesn't work in the NFL today. So don't
tell Mac Jones about that.
Does a single, like running a certain amount of run plays, you're incurring a negative EPA. You want to say you're likely incurring a negative EPA, but by doing that, you're allowing yourself to increase your EPA from passing. Like
it's almost like a loss leader when talking about from a business perspective, like a product that isn't going to sell that great on its own, but it sort of gets people in the door and allows you to get benefits in other ways.
The reasons to run the ball are to hopefully maximize your EPA across a full game rather than on any individual play. And some of the things that rushing does, like your offensive linemen get a chance to beat up the dude in front of them, and they have one less opportunity to get made look foolish by those super athletic freaks that are in front of them. There's kind of only so much pass protection I think you can do, especially if you're talking about doing some more deep drop stuff and things like that. And clearly there's value in running the ball, even if in terms of you have a lead and you're trying to fight the clock more than you are trying to create EPA. That's a thing that kind of could get lost there. So there's definitely those examples. I am kind of interested though in like, how do you think about that on a drive level? Because it's not as directly a loss leader. Like there's no rule that says you have to run the ball,
Going on those lines on the drive-by-drive case, you almost have to look at what your goal is for each drive. So say, 80% of the time you're looking to score on a drive throughout the normal state of the game. However, say you're winning by 20 points or so, and then you're at the end of the game and the goal is to accumulate first downs and bleed clock. You're not necessarily looking to score points. So adding expected points might be a little lower on that case, but you're still completing your objective of trying to win the football game.
And I guess you could say, even if in a more micro level, like on any given play based on down and distance, if you only need to gain 2 yards, you don't really need to play a high variance game with throwing it. You can take the tighter distribution of outcomes and run it. So they're definitely both at a drive, entire drive level, but also at a play-by-play within the drive level. That does sort of inform your decision making.
Now, when you have a situation, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this, when you have a situation where, say, that first down play, whatever you did, you get to a 2nd and 2. You only need 2 yards, but you also know you have 2 opportunities there. Is your first reaction to, well, let me get my first down, get the EPA boost, and continue this drive? Or do you say, we have a free opportunity to go get a massive chunk of yards? Like, what's your guys? I know that different situations, different teams can call for different things, but like, what's your guys' impulse there? Would you take what you can get and keep the EPA going, or do you go take a shot?
Like you said at the beginning, my strong reaction is definitely like, what's the situation of the game? How good is my team versus how good the other team is, and how good am I in different phases? Like, do I feel like I can move the ball otherwise? But one of the things growing up that I think watching football with my dad that would drive him crazy was, why do they keep running it up the middle all the time? And eventually Alan Manocherian was proved right. Teams were running it up the middle too much of the time. You should pass more, you should run more outside, and we're starting to get there and finding a better balance spot there. The other one was 2nd and 1 running. Why are you running on 2nd and 1? You have this blessing of an extra opportunity here with, you have all of the reward and like, just don't get sacked here, but take a shot. Like, for God's sakes, take a shot. Like, what are you thinking not doing that? It's a free play. And if you get 0 yards, you've still got 2 downs to get a first down, 2 downs to get that 1 yard. You can't do that. You deserve to lose. Right. So yeah, if you're ahead by a lot, it's different. If you can't move the ball, and so it's going to be a low scoring game, and you're just trying to eke out that first down, sure, all that kind of stuff. But in general, I've strongly leaned towards, obviously not 100% of the time passing in that situation, but being a strong, I would want to look at the end of the season and saw that I ran it like 15% of the time there. I wouldn't want it to be a number higher than that.
I guess what I would say to sort of counter that is I would want to run on 2nd and 1 more often than I typically would run in a short yardage situation, like more than the average short yardage situation. But I would say that it's sort of similar to like a betting circumstance where if you've already cashed on a couple of bets and you're up, your following bets could either be more aggressive, sort of like playing with house money type thing, or you can go back to being conservative and basically sort of like bank the gains you've already gotten and not introduce risk to then go lose that benefit you've already gained. So like in the example of 2nd and 1 and you throw an incompletion and now you're at 3rd and 1, you've now sort of lost the value you gained by having that nice run on first down.
I still think you're ahead of the 8 ball. Like,
yeah, I guess you're probably, I mean, the difference between whatever 2nd and 1 versus 2nd and 2 or 3 might be small in terms of whether you're ahead of the 8 ball or not. But I think just in general, there is something to be said for having a positive play but the positive play, like getting that to that 2nd and 1 really only improves your situation in the sense that it improves your chances of getting a first down and continuing the drive, right? So like the advantage to having 2nd and 1 is that you will very likely get the first down coming after that, and running on 2nd and 1 and potentially with, reasonably high confidence getting that 1 yard sort of cashes in that expectation advantage that you got from the first down, because those 9 yards aren't really valuable as much for those 9 yards as they are for the first down that is implied from the 9 yards.
I know you're smarter than me, but I strongly disagree with the way that you're presenting this. I don't know, Stephen, James, are you guys team Alex here, or can you explain it to me in a different way to make it make sense to me?
It's funny because I'm very much, I can say in my betting history, I'm very much of the I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. I'm going to bank my winnings. So when it's put that way, I very much side with Alex. But when I'm playing in a football perspective,
yeah,
right, I'm very much like, well, I have an opportunity to like hit them while they're down, like catch them on their heels. I can get a huge play here with little risk of blowing that. So I'm going to take that risk because my risk on the, you want to say the loss there, I have the free play, is much smaller.
The clock is a great point. That is definitely a distinction between, a bet and a football game, right? You have a theoretically infinite time horizon for betting, whereas you do not have a theoretically infinite time horizon for scoring points.
So I want to go back to this concept of EPA not being a individual stat. This is something that I will go to my grave saying, and I don't think that like most analytics, Twitter, things like that, I don't feel like people are really conscious of this. So help me out, guys. What do we mean when we say that EPA is not a team stat, is not a player stat, that it is a team stat, not a player stat? And why is drawing that distinction important? Or why is it not? And we should just say the number one in EPA is the MVP.
So like on an individual basis, I would guess to say you can look at things on a subjective or like scouting basis, I guess to say, you can't look at Patrick Mahomes and say, wow, that was an unbelievably thrown ball. That's something that EPA wouldn't account for, or say something along the lines of, the receiver, made that play happen by making that catch. It's almost the subjectiveness to it where you have to look at the film and say, oh, okay, most of this EPA should be quote unquote accredited to the receiver for making the play, or, Patrick Mahomes made the unbelievable throw and the EPA should be more accredited to him. So with EPA not able to do that, to say, that's why I think that you really can't break it down to a player level.
And I don't think that that's like, you're saying EPA is not able to do that. That almost makes EPA sound like insufficient. It's just not cast for this, right? It's using purely game state information. It knows nothing about who's on the field. It knows nothing about what happened on the play. It just says like this state to this state, this is what happened. And
right.
In fairness, yards has the same.
Oh, sure.
Problem.
Yeah.
Like we're very like, he had 300 passing yards. He had 100 receiving yards. And we don't think about like the other 9 guys on offense, the 11 on defense, and what role they played in those yards. Like we don't like, we might like, if you recently you have stuff where you'd say like this corner allowed 80 yards in coverage, and like, you know what, you can start to get on that sort of level of things. But still, at the end of the day, what we're really saying is there was a 30-yard pass on this play, and these were the 2 people that actually pitched and caught the thing. But like, we're kind of ignoring everybody else and the role that, which is kind of why his football stats historically suck. And EPA does nothing to fix that.
Yeah, it's better because it puts everybody on the same playing field, so to speak. And
One currency.
Yeah,
right?
one currency in a way that but that really, to be honest, in terms of player evaluation, the only way that really helps you, because again, yards, EPA, the difference in EPA is sort of the difference in yards, right?
It's a fancier adjusted net yards per attempt.
Right, exactly.
Like at the end of the day, like, but how do we decide how much a touchdown is worth and how much an interception is worth compared to a yard? We can do the fantasy points formula. We can do the adjusted net yards per attempt formula, or we can let EPA take care of it implicitly, which we all like better, but it doesn't solve the other stuff.
Right. The thing is that at the end of the day, no one's talking. People are talking about like Matthew Stafford's EPA or whatever. People aren't talking about like the Rams' offensive line's EPA, because that's not the way that anybody thinks about it. And as soon as you start to think about it that way, you start to realize like, oh, this is a silly thing to be saying in the first place, to assign it to a player.
I think the only sense where the EPA can, you want to say, matter to a player is in the quarterbacks, and that's why I like bringing them up. A Jimmy Garoppolo, he's a great example here. He's 7th on that same list that I had mentioned before. It's a reflection of how efficient is the 49ers offense when Jimmy Garoppolo is the quarterback. And I think the only reason you can say it matters on a player basis for the quarterback is because they're the only player who touches the ball on every play. You could say besides the center. But like a wide receiver, going back to the point of like, it doesn't matter. It's not counting.
Going back to Alex's last point, I would say Jimmy Garoppolo with that offensive line had 7th place in EPA.
Sure.
Isn't that already an improvement over saying that it's just Jimmy Garoppolo that did that? Like,
well, yes, of course it factors in everything else. And a pass that Jimmy Garoppolo throws that's 5 yards down the field that Debo houses for 75 goes in the books as a Jimmy Garoppolo 75-yard passing touchdown.
And 4
huge
EPA
result
for him. Whatever. Yeah.
Right. So, yes.
EPA, whatever.
I just think I guess I'm making the argument for the quarterback. It's a gauge of how well they're doing. It's not necessarily a specific to how well is the quarterback playing. It's how well is the quarterback playing in the.
I think this
in
is
the
dangerously
context.
close to like a quarterback wins argument. Honestly, like I really feel like the point you're making at its core is the quarterback has the most effect on the offense, and therefore EPA is kind of appropriate for them because it's mostly their responsibility anyway. And yeah, I agree with that, but like it's still not a player stat.
the second, and I guess maybe I should have started with the other end of this argument, is to say like for any running back or receiver or defender, that context matters way more. And that like for a receiver, their EPA, what if they're only thrown at on 3rd downs? Like these stats, I want to say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like JD McKissick for the Commanders, he probably comes out looking like a stud of a running back. But the context is he gets targets on 3rd downs and picks up 1st downs. And he's going to look like, wow, what an excellent receiving back. But that context is ignored. So for all other positions that isn't quarterback, I'm arguing it's that context is too great to leave out, that you're not seeing the full picture. And it's just a different representation of the same stat line that we see and are accustomed to.
That I'm amenable to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go that far. I think we're going to circle back to like the player stats, and I want to talk about how like EPA and it relates to player stats, but you just brought up a different point that I think we should dive into a little bit, and that is that downs are different. 3rd down is going to have the highest effect on EPA because you have the opportunity to go to first down or go to fourth down and likely turning the ball over to the other team from there. So it has an outsized effect. A 3-yard gain on 3rd and 2 is really nice positive EPA play, whereas on 1st and 10, that's a slight negative 3 yards and really not a major impact either way. So how should we think about this? How should we think about EPA, given that we know that most EPA is, I think, as much is created on 3rd down as 1st and 2nd down combined, something like that?
It's equal. So basically, 1st down, 2nd down, and 3rd down are all roughly equal in terms of total amount of EPA.
Oh, because there are more 1st and 2nd downs.
Right. There are twice as many 1st downs as 3rd downs, but the amount of total EPA is the same because it's so much more is thrown around per play on 3rd down.
How does that affect things? Like when we go back to the leaderboard, does that, as we think about EPA, should we say split it by what you're doing on 1st and 2nd down versus what you're doing on 3rd down because they're just such different sort of like expectation situations? Or is it okay? Is it not problematic that we combine it all together? Because at the end of the day, it all kind of equals out.
I think I'm okay with it all coming out in the wash because let's think of an offense where they don't ever get to 3rd down and they just continue 1st and 2nd conversion, 1st, 2nd conversion. Like those are big enough. They're getting big EPA swings from getting another 1st down. The small, I mean, at the end of the day, whether it takes you, I guess, removing the clock from the situation. But if you have a 1st and 10 at the 20, and then at some point you get to a 1st and 10 at the 40, in the EPA calculation, your expected points added from that on is the exact same. If you are moving, you're moving to that new game state, and that's what EPA is measuring is how you're getting to that new game state. If that happens on one 20-yard pass or it happens on takes you 6 plays to get those 20 yards, I care less. I think I like looking at it in the more holistic view of like in total they were able to generate this much more value.
I think I agreed with everything you said and I came to the opposite conclusion. What do you other guys think?
I think so because I was with Stephen to a point and then I disagreed at the very end. But where basically like if it takes you 5 plays to get 40 yards, the composition of those 5 plays, if I had, you know, 2 20-yard passes and 3 0-yard plays versus 5 8-yard plays, like those are sort of indistinguishable from an EPA perspective. But to get 1 play for 40 yards versus 6 plays for 40 yards is a different conversation in terms of how reliable is that offense, how, you know, repeatable is that sort of thing. So yeah, certainly if I know that I'm going to take the same number of plays to get the same number of yards, the EPA will measure it the same. I probably am relatively indifferent as to how we got that.
It's not interesting to you if like you're really bad on 1st and 2nd down and really good on 3rd down, or if you're really, or vice versa?
Well,
it might reveal something.
It might reveal something because the defense is going to play differently. Like if I'm always in 3rd and 10 and I'm always converting, then I'm probably also in situations in which the defense is playing differently than they're playing on 1st and 2nd down, and I'm taking advantage of some change in the way that my offense and their defense interact. The bigger thing that I would be concerned about is the sort of like Super Bowl era Eagles thing of like having crazy 3rd down and 4th down success and that not being a repeatable thing. So like a lot of the value that you've accumulated and that you could measure in EPA and it would be high EPA is not value that I would expect to repeat next year.
1st and 2nd down EPA might be more predictive than 3rd down EPA.
Yeah, because basically you're taking coin. If you view like all plays as like a bunch of random coin tosses with different weights on them, like the winnings associated with those coin flips are much higher in either direction on 3rd down. And so while the process was the same of flipping coins, the results get really wild on 3rd and 4th down.
So that's interesting. The idea of sort of muting 3rd down EPA results or like scaling it based on the variance. so that all plays would have equal. And then you run into the problem where you're like, but no, that 10-yard pass on third down was more important than the 10-yard pass on first down. The defense was playing differently, and so I think you always end up sacrificing something to gain something in this conversation.
I think if you believe that clutch is a reliable trait, you want third down and fourth down to be more valued. And if you think that clutch is not something that we can effectively measure or rely upon, then you'd be more inclined to stick with first and second down, or do something that we've tried but have not exactly nailed down a method of doing, which is exactly what you're saying. Like take EPA and scale down the third and fourth down impact so that it's more in line with first and second down.
Worth testing the predictiveness, right?
But I do think that there is, and I guess I was unclear in the way I was presenting the argument originally. Like in a third down situation, I think EPA does properly matter. It's showing the value of those downs a lot more, and I believe it's accurate when you're watching a game, right? And it's the opposing team has first down, they have second down, then all of a sudden it's third down. You kind of sit up a little bit, like, okay, this is a huge swing in the game right here. Like I think that comes out in EPA, and I like that it does that, because I think those are the plays that do decide games. Not to say that first and second downs don't matter, but those are the big swings of the game, and it comes out in the statistic because it is weighting those game states.
Right. There's a descriptive versus predictive thing going on there, and that certainly relates to like the clutch thing that Alex was talking about. I definitely agree that like if you're looking to understand why a team beat another team and you look back at the stats, you don't want to like mute the third down stuff because the game results won't make any sense. But if you're trying to think about how those teams are most likely to perform, and you think that you're operating under the premise that each play is should relatively have the same opportunity to create value or not, which is a questionable assumption, then you might have something that would be more valuable for understanding how we expect people to perform in the future. Which goes back to the player. This also, I think, relates back to the player point. I think everything that we're talking about makes a little bit more sense if you think about it in terms of player level usage sort of versus the team level usage. Because with the team level, it does get a little bit like, at the end of the day, it all adds up to what it adds up to. Let's go to that player section. So Alex, I'll start with you. What are some of the challenges of total points, a metric that takes EPA and essentially divides that up amongst the players on the field? What limitations does total points have because it's based on EPA? And also what does it do to like counteract some of the limitations of EPA, I guess, is part of that question too. But I think that'll help understand. I don't ask this question because I want to get into a total points tangent. I do want to just understand a little bit more the steps that we take when thinking about EPA on a player level as opposed to a team level, and why those steps are appropriate.
Yeah. So I mentioned before the one step that total points takes, which is called the play selection adjustment, which is basically saying like in a given game state, sort of in a given EPA game state, what is the expected EPA from that spot? And particularly with a notion of like, did I choose to run or did I choose to pass? And when I choose to run, my expectation is lower. And so total points sort of gives players who were involved on the offensive side on a running play a little bit of a boost because they were involved in a play that on average is less successful.
So we call it the play selection adjustment. This is not like Sean McVay versus Jeff Fisher type play selection adjustment. It's purely run pass.
Yeah, there's more to it, but it boils down to, in most cases, run versus pass. So that's one element that we added in to total points that makes it better able to evaluate runners and passers in the same scheme. The other thing that I'll mention is sort of along the lines of the third down thing. Like 2 of the last 3 years, I think, the total points leader at quarterback was a somewhat, or not the leader, but there were multiple guys who were sort of like surprising at the top or near the top of the total points leaderboard. Justin Herbert led last year. Aaron Rodgers, the year before he came back and won MVP, was leading. Derek Carr has been very high. And the thing that is true of all of those guys is they were all very successful on third and fourth down. And that is something that you see on the field. I mean, watching Herbert last year was kind of nuts in terms of his third and fourth down performance.
Yeah, you think of that one game where he had, what did they have? 7 fourth down conversions?
Yeah.
Like that? Yeah.
And so that's a thing that really happens, and you watch and you're like, wow, that's amazing. He's really, gutting it out there. And so we measure that within total points using EPA as the basis for it. But that means that you get these like bigger swings than you'd expect. And the third thing I'll mention that we think is the right thing to do in total points, but doesn't necessarily mean that it lines up as well with EPA as you want, is if I say that there's, a quarter of a point of EPA on the play and I'm, quote, dividing up the credit, well, when I say that, it sounds like I'm taking 0.25 and I'm actually separating it into pieces, but some players were actually performing negatively and some players were performing sufficiently positively that they might individually have more value than the play itself because other players were doing poorly and that made their job more difficult. The most common example being like a blown block by the offensive line makes the job much more difficult for the quarterback. And so if he has a successful play, he's actually doing more than the result of the play.
Right. If your left tackle gets beaten in 1.5 seconds and is right there to make the tackle on the quarterback and the quarterback spins out of that tackle, regardless of what happens after that point, the fact that they were able to avoid that sack right there is an above average performance by them, despite the fact that this play might still end up being an incompletion or whatever else.
Yeah. So total points, by breaking that potential rule you could have of saying like no player can go outside of the range of the play, that means that there's more room for the sum of the players' credit on the play being different than the total EPA on the play. And so we end up with, in total, everything sort of adds up together and it all ends up hunky-dory at the end of the season. But on an individual play basis, you'll see examples where there are players who are getting like a sort of outsized value, positive or negative, relative to what happened just in terms of EPA on the play.
So what other currencies might be interesting for thinking about player value, right? Like making a metric based around EPA is pretty interesting. I think win probability would be an obvious choice. That would be a perilous one that I wouldn't recommend going down that road any more than anybody already has, because it's going to swing wildly based on the leverage of situations. It was much too wildly. What other currencies might be interesting? Like obviously there's grades out there. That's a thing. Are there other ways to think about quantifying player stats that might be more effective than thinking about it through like an EPA based lens?
I think that the concept that we discussed briefly a few minutes ago of expected points added with a sort of tempering of third and fourth downs is at least worth exploring for the reasons that we've talked about. And you can think about that in terms of sort of like directly, reducing the changes in results on third and fourth downs, or you can think of it in terms of like some kind of leverage adjustment, saying like in this particular game state, the leverage is the kind of swings I can see are much higher. I'm going to try and sort of reduce that down. Or I've seen people use like sort of a parabolic curve to say like in neutral game state situations, I don't really do anything, but as I get away from a neutral game state, I'm going to downweight plays. So it's not that I'm actually changing any individual play. I'm just reducing the weight of plays that occur in garbage time or something like that. Any of those kinds of adjustments are, as you say, like kind of perilous because there are lots of plays that you're probably legitimately throwing out or downweighting that do have some predictive value, do have some measure of how good that player was. And you're throwing that away to some extent. But I think they would be interesting to explore and would be interesting as a way of providing sort of like multiple looks at a player or at a team.
I'm thinking like a totally different context, maybe something where we basically have thought about total points in terms of what is the value of everything happening on the play and who's responsible for that value, which is totally reasonable. Maybe a different way to think about it would be, what was the player asked to do on the play and how well did they perform what they were asked to do, whether it's relative to average or relative to where you're looking at things as this receiver earned a target whatever percentage of the time, and he caught the ball on whatever percentage of those targets. And through all of these different efficiencies of the different aspects of how they may impact a game or play, we're able to look at that. But, we're not thinking about, we're sort of evaluating them more when they're more involved and less when they're less involved. Maybe that's the same thing.
I feel like your argument you're making right now, Matt, is basically just to frame all stats relative to expectations.
I think
That's
it's
how
a
I'm
little
interpreting it.
It sounds like a little bit of that, but also to, instead of using a currency of points, you're using like opportunities, like percent of opportunities in which you were, it's basically success rate, right?
Yeah.
But not success rate in terms of, and for what it's worth, it's kind of odd that we haven't mentioned this at some point, but like EPA based success rate is a big deal. And it's basically saying like, if I, from a given game state, like how many yards would I need to gain to break even from an expected points perspective?
It's a binary version of the same thing.
Yeah. So and I think that, first of all, an EPA-based success rate is a potential solution to these like third and fourth down swings, because it's just like success or failure. The range is a lot smaller. But in general, the notion of success rate from a conceptual perspective, saying like, ignore points, ignore any of these things, like, did you do a good thing or not, is, first of all, it's, if you're saying like things are something's dangerously close to quarterback wins, that's dangerously close to grading players. But you have to be careful there. But I do think that notion is valuable because it is capping the swing that you can get from the game state. It potentially also like dulls those plays in a way that you wouldn't want to. Like some of those plays are legitimately more important, and considering them as entirely equivalent is probably also not appropriate.
And maybe I'm being a bit influenced by like basketball thought that I've been having lately, like where in basketball, just the notion of usage and efficiency being like so separated and such distinct thoughts. I think I'm wanting for something like that to think about player value, and not just like he got this many targets, but like really understanding how much we are asking of our left tackle and how well he's performing based on what we're asking of him. And I don't know if we have a great answer for how to do that right now. Like, I think we have answers. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud, and I think there might be something there. Stephen, don't worry. You won't have to deal with this kind of talk from me for much longer.
I think it's a question of whether you have how much you know about what the intent is. And maybe that's different in basketball versus football in terms of how much you can judge based on just watching a play what everyone was being asked to do. But that to me is the biggest problem, is that, if a guy's running an option route, we're not charting all of the options, and we're not charting the progression for the quarterback. So there are a lot of unknown factors that contribute to how you would evaluate a player and how you evaluate like the process and how well they did what they were asked to do, because we don't know what they were asked to do.
Yeah, that might be a little bit different than what I'm thinking, because like basketball usage rate is like, did you shoot it? Like, it's not as nuanced as anything else. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. I feel like I derailed things a little bit, so I'll get off of that, and we've got to wrap up relatively soon too. Good point that we like kind of ignored success rate for a while there, and that's a great way to kind of. I like always looking at success rate and EPA kind of next to each other. You get the total value, and then you also get like the how consistent were you achieving what you set out to do. Other thoughts before we break up? This has been a fun kind of thought hour.
I don't have anything major other than to say I very much like EPA as a team-based stat. I think it does a great job. It's much better than any of the, you want to say, some metrics that we give. So things like, team had total amount of yards, and I think the biggest thing that EPA can get swayed by is in garbage time, that it's treating a play that's at the end of the fourth quarter where it's a 1-point game the same as a play in the fourth quarter that's in a 30-point game. So we can sit here and know that you can know that a play or a team has just been eating up a ton of fantasy points. Fantasy points is a great example. just you wait for the end of games where they can just basically freely walk down the field, get 85 yards and a touchdown. In the grand scheme of things, that means nothing, but it still goes in the books as part of the whole to say, hey, look, the Jared Goff offense was awesome in the fourth quarter. And it's, well, okay, they were probably playing against a defense that did not care because they were getting killed.
Yeah.
So I think that's the one asterisk that goes on to it. But if you can look through EPA in game states that aren't as a part of, you want to say what you would consider as garbage time, then I think there's a lot of value there.
All right, last question before we break. Hypothetically, it's 2nd and 1. I want to go back to this scenario. You've got Kyle Pitts. Does that change your answer at all? Hypothetically, does that affect anything?
I mean, my answer is always going to be give the ball to Kyle Pitts, but maybe that's just me.
I thought you were going to plead the fifth there. Yeah, I think that's a safe decision. All right, guys, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. Let's sign off. For Stephen Polacheck, Alex Vigderman, James Weaver, and our producer, Justin Stein, I'm Matt Manocherian. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.